At this point in the year, we're looking at plants as this multicellular organism. And we have to understand that we have specialized cells. And some cells are specialized, for example, to perform photosynthesis. So if you look at the leaves are specialized to perform photosynthesis. And remember, photosynthesis is actually going to use water as a source of electrons. If you think back to the Z scheme, remember we're going to use light and enzymes to actually lyse water, photolysis, collect those electrons, excite the electrons, use it to create a hydrogen ion gradient, use that hydrogen ion gradient to produce ATP, and use the Z scheme to actually reduce and store those electrons for the Calvin cycle as well. So a good quick little review. You might want to take this time to go back and look at the Z scheme. But the leaves do need a source of water. However, because plants are now on land, and they're competing for sunlight, so there's an advantage to grow taller, because of that, they're not where the water is. Most of the water is going to be stored here in the ground. And so they do need a way to transport water. The main ways that plants transport water is through using xylem. Xylem cells are dead at maturity. But they are going to be connected to be able to transport water from the roots up into the leaves. And so this is a really great diagram that shows us that the water potential is very high in the soil. And this is because there's a high concentration of water. The water concentration is high down here. The water concentration in the air is usually very low, but you can see that it changes with humidity. Remember, humidity is a measure of the amount of water vapor in the air. So if it's a very humid day, the water potential in the air might be slightly higher. But as an overall trend, you have a higher water potential in the ground than you do in the air. And so this is going to create a gradient. And this is going to actually help provide the force for moving water from the roots up to the very top of the tree. And so we do want to realize that when we're talking about transport in plants, we're talking about both through the organism and through individual cells. We do want to go back and remember the principles of water potential. So really, we want to divide this into two little sections. We want to remember the molecular behavior of water. If you go back and look at your water molecule with your oxygen and your two hydrogens, remember oxygen is more electronegative. It will have a slight negative pole on the molecule. The hydrogens will have a slight positive pole. And we end up with a polar molecule. And this is all because of the electronegativity of oxygen in the water. This polar molecule, or the polarity, is going to lead to some specific properties. And so you do want to be able to go back in your notes and look at the 5 main properties of water, of which some of them are going to be cohesion and adhesion. 2 very important properties. So make sure that you go back and look at that. But when we actually look at water potential principles, we're looking at transport, and we have some equations. Water potential is the result of pressure potential plus solute potential. Pressure and solute. Water potential is pressure potential plus solute potential. Now solute potential is negative I for the ionization factor, C for the concentration, R, which is a set value, and T, which is the temperature. And so you do need to know these equations. It's a review from before in the year. But it does remind us that the ability or the potential of water to move is dependent on both the pressure of the cell or environment and the solute potential, which solute potential is a result of how much the solute ionizes, the concentration, the temperature, and a standard factor. So we want to go back and possibly work a problem. A plant cell is gaining water. That means that water is moving into the plant cell. Now remember, water moves from high water potential to low water potential. So if the cell is gaining water, that must mean that the cell has a lower water potential than the environment. If water is moving into the cell, that must mean that the cell has a lower water potential than the environment. The environment has a water potential of 0.3 megapascals. The unit doesn't matter to you, except that you should know that this means that the cell has a lower water potential than 0.3 megapascals. So when we set up our equation, we can now start to substitute. Instead of writing the water potential equals, we're going to substitute water potential with less than 3. So if the water potential equals the pressure and the solute potential, this means that the pressure and the solute potential must be less, because these equal the water potential, they must be less than 0.3. The turgor pressure from the cell wall is 0.2. So this means that we now are substituting 0.3 is less than 0.2 plus the solute potential, which means that I need to subtract here, and 0.1 is less than what the solute potential is going to be. I'm sorry, the solute potential is less than 0.1 is the way that we should read that. And this makes sense because solute potential is always a negative number. So the solute potential is going to be less than 0.1. Now, these are your overall water potential principles that explain how water is expected to move. Now I want to look at how it actually moves in plant cells. We do want to remind ourselves of something called an aquaporin. An aquaporin is going to be a protein channel in the cell membrane of all organisms. So this is an idea of unity. All organisms have aquaporins, so this is a trait that they inherited. And this protein channel is specific to water, and it allows for the passive transport of water. Water is always going to move passively, and we call this osmosis. And so we do want to know that aquaporins are found in the cell membrane, and that when the water moves in, it's going to be moving in through those aquaporins. Now the roots are the main organ that are going to be absorbing water. Roots are what absorb the water, and so their structure increases water absorption rates. Now, one of the things that we want to know is that they actually have an increased surface area. There are things called root hairs, which are extensions of the cytoplasm that you can see here. This root hair is an extension of the cytoplasm, increases the surface area, and we will see that roots are very convoluted or folded as well. The other way is that they are actively going to maintain a mineral concentration. So this means that we are actively pumping ions to help maintain a high concentration of ions. So we're going to see a very high concentration of ions in the root cells. And this means because we have a high concentration of ions, that means that water is going to move passively. So when we have a high concentration of ions, water will diffuse into that area. So by the plant cell pumping ions, not pumping water, pumping ions, that is going to cause water to diffuse passively into the roots. And so you do need to be able to make some predictions about water transport in the plant. The second part that we are really going to focus on is this idea of transpiration. Transpiration is the evaporation of water from the stomata. And the transpiration is actually what provides the majority of the force to allow water to passively transport even against gravity. So moving up a really tall tree, how does that happen? It's because of the transpiration force. It's because as water evaporates through the stomata, remember the stomata is open to allow for gas exchange. But when the stomata is open and the gases are exchanging, remember CO2 will be coming in and oxygen will be coming out, but also what is coming out is water. And as water evaporates, it's actually going to pull other water molecules behind it using cohesion. Because water molecules are polar and they stick to each other. So as water is evaporated from the stomata, it will actually pull other water molecules up behind it. Now because xylem is hollow, it also allows for adhesion and the ability of the water to stick and pull up the sides of the xylem. And so we see that as water evaporates through the open stomata, that we're going to see transpiration pull the water up. Now we do need to be able to regulate the transpiration rate. We need to balance gas exchange, because remember we need CO2 for Rubisco. We don't have CO2, Rubisco will actually start breaking down our carbohydrates. We need to balance gas exchange with water loss. And so you have the stomata. The stomata is the pore. And the guard cells, this is just the opening. The stomata is just the opening. Now stomata are found on the bottom of most leaves, not the top because there's more heat there. And the number of stomata can actually vary. And so what we see is that we're actually going to pump ions in, water will diffuse, will swell the cells, and open the pore. And so we're really going to stop there. However, the last part is on phloem. We do want to go back later and review what CAM plants do, closing the stomata during the day. But we quickly want to introduce the idea of phloem, which is the ability to transport sugar and hormones bidirectionally. So xylem up and phloem down, transporting sugars down from the leaves what we actually see is this idea that we're going to have to use ATP to load or pump sugars. And then water will enter and passively push the sugars down. That's where we're stopping for today.